Have you ever dealt with a coworker who was just absolutely determined to undermine you at every single turn?
Oh, yeah. We all know the type.
Right. Like
Ugh.
someone that doesn't just, disagree with your ideas in a meeting, but actively saves your emails.
Yeah, highlights the typos.
Exactly. Highlights the typos, builds this meticulously indexed binder of your mistakes, just waiting for the absolute perfect moment to, present it to the boss.
It is a universally exhausting workplace dynamic. I mean, you end up spending half your time doing your actual job and the other half just, well, defending your right to exist in the office.
Yeah, it's brutal. But imagine if the stakes weren't just about who gets the corner office or, who takes credit for the latest marketing campaign.
Right.
What if you scale that exact same petty, toxic workplace rivalry up until it literally determined the fate of an entire subcontinent?
That is a massive escalation.
It is. So, welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are opening up the late 18th century administration of Bengal.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, we are looking at this incredibly bitter, really high-stakes rivalry between two men in the British East India Company, that's Governor-General Warren Hastings, and a member of his council, Philip Francis.
And just to set the parameters right up front for anyone joining us, we are looking at this strictly through the lens of the historical mechanics.
Right, exactly.
We aren't here to, endorse the underlying goals of 18th century imperialism on either side of this debate.
No, definitely not.
What we have here is, it's basically a masterclass in bureaucratic warfare. It's about the overwhelming power of public relations and the devastating consequences of forcing an imported ideological framework onto a really highly complex local reality.
Yeah, so before we can even get into the actual policies they were fighting over, which, essentially boiled down to how to extract wealth from Bengal, we really need to establish the ground rules of their rivalry.
Yeah, because their distinct personalities essentially guaranteed this would become a total disaster.
Totally. So Hastings is the guy who's actually in charge on the ground, which means he's, constantly putting out fires.
Right. He is the pragmatic statesman. I mean, Hastings is out there managing this massive, sprawling, constantly shifting empire in real time.
Which sounds exhausting.
It was. Circumstances on the ground in Bengal were incredibly volatile, which meant his policies just had to be adaptable.
Right. You can't be rigid in that situation.
Exactly. But that adaptability actually became his greatest vulnerability.
Also.
Well, Hastings was known for being a brilliant writer, but he often wrote hurriedly, just out of sheer necessity. The Latin phrase historically used to describe his style is currente calamo.
Currente calamo.
Yeah, it means writing with a running pen.
Okay, so he's firing off these brilliant, but maybe slightly contradictory, like late-night Slack messages of the 18th century because he's trying to solve 5 crises at once.
Exactly. He's reacting to whatever the immediate argument dictates without, constantly cross-referencing his past memos.
Right, because who has the time?
Right. But that leaves a massive paper trail of shifting opinions. And sitting right there on the council is Philip Francis.
Ah, the co-worker with the binder.
Precisely. Francis wasn't burdened with the actual execution of these policies. He is described historically as a compiler.
A compiler?
Yeah. Francis understands perfectly how to weaponize his opponent's messy reality. I mean, he watches Hastings adapt to changing facts, and he just meticulously collects those hasty council minutes.
It's totally the 18th century equivalent of modern political opposition research.
It really is.
Francis is just sitting in the corner, keeping the receipts. He's curating this portfolio of Hastings' adaptations to frame him as wildly inconsistent and, well, erratic.
Because Francis knew his audience. He knew that the people back in London, the politicians and, superficial critics who had never even set foot in India, would look at a curated list of Hastings' changing opinions and just see a man with terrible judgment.
Oh, that is so manipulative.
Yeah, it is. Francis packaged Hastings' necessary on-the-ground adaptations as a total misconception of facts, driven by a wild imagination.
That sets up a terrifying dynamic for any organization.
Yeah.
You have one guy trying to govern reality and another guy focused entirely on curating a narrative for the shareholders back home.
Exactly. And this personal warfare eventually crashes into the actual ground zero of their conflict.
Right, the money.
Yes, managing the revenues of Bengal. This brings us to the economic battlefield. They desperately needed a new system because the previous one, the 5-year plan, or the quinquennial settlement, was an absolute disaster.
I feel like history is just littered with failed 5-year plans.
Oh, universally. And this one was spectacularly bad. Hastings tried to defend it after the fact, claiming it was the best option available at the time and that its failure was due to unforeseeable events.
Well, Francis had the receipts, right?
He brought the brutal numbers to the council. So for the year ending April 1773, the revenue was officially settled at over 1.92 crore rupees.
Okay, 1.92 crore.
But the actual money that made it into the treasury was only about 1.33 crore.
Wait, really? My math might be a little rusty, but even in the 18th century, missing your target by almost 5.9 million rupees is a catastrophic shortfall.
It's huge.
How do you even mess up a projection that badly?
Well, Francis argued it wasn't an accident. He pointed out that the committee used something called an increasing jumma.
What's that?
It's an assessment that artificially inflated the expected revenue year over year. Francis basically accused the committee of deliberately setting these impossibly high expectations just to exhaust the country for a year or two.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, the mechanism here is classic corruption. You set the tax farm rates absurdly high, force local collectors to bid exorbitant amounts, take your cut or your brags on the front end, and then
Let the whole system collapse.
exactly. Let the system collapse while you walk away with a fortune, leaving the mess for the next administration.
So Francis isn't just calling Hastings erratic anymore. He's implying gross mismanagement and, systemic corruption.
Yep. The 5-year plan is dead. The treasury is short. They have to come up with a replacement.
And this is where we see exactly how differently these two men view the world. Hastings, the pragmatist, he proposes something called a hustabud.
Yes, a hustabud.
Yeah.
It was an intensive, on-the-ground reality check. Hastings wanted to send out a commission to conduct an actual, accurate valuation of what the rents and the lands were currently worth.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, we're talking about commissioners walking the fields, looking at the crops, assessing the actual economic health of the villages.
Gathering data.
Exactly, gathering precise data so the new revenue settlement could be based on objective reality.
I mean, if you are going to tax a region, the very first step should be figuring out how much wealth is actually there to be taxed. It seems like the most logical, basic requirement of government.
You would think so, but Francis vehemently rejected the idea.
Wait, why?
He completely opposed the hustabud. He had a radically different, purely theoretical approach. Francis proposed that the revenue should be deduced not from what the land could actually bear, but from an estimate of what the government needed for its expenses.
Wait, hold on. Let me stop you there, because I really want to make sure you, listening to this, are grasping the absolute absurdity of this.
It is quite absurd.
Francis wanted to sit in a room, tally up the government's budget, the army, the administration, the dividends, and then just demand that total amount from the land permanently.
Yes.
Permanently.
That's like budgeting your personal life based on the yacht you want to buy, not the salary you actually earn. Well, I need $1 million for my boat, so my job just has to pay me $1 million. It completely divorces taxation from the economic reality of the people being taxed.
That is a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
He called it the tumar jumma, a permanently fixed quit rent. He argued passionately that government expenses should dictate the revenue, and once set, it should never, ever change.
That is wild. Right. But to your point about divorcing it from reality, historical analysis shows his estimates for the government's needs between 1776 and 1784 would have been a disastrous miscalculation.
Because reality doesn't care about your spreadsheet.
Exactly.
What were the specific variables Francis was just completely ignoring by refusing to look at the actual land?
The most glaring blind spot was the wastelands. Bengal had recently suffered a devastating famine.
Oh, right.
It wiped out a massive portion of the population and left huge tracts of previously farmed land uncultivated. Francis's fixed permanent system completely failed to account for this.
How does that play out mechanically?
Well, think about it. If you fix the revenue permanently today, what happens in 10 years when those wastelands are eventually reclaimed and farmed by squatters or new tenants?
Oh, I see. Under a fixed system, the government can't tax that newly generated wealth,
Precisely the problem. The new squatter becomes immune from additional taxation.
while the people who are already there get screwed.
Yes, the established estates, the people who survived the famine and kept farming, are forced to bear the entire burden of any future government financial crises.
This kind of bridges us to the core mystery of this rivalry. Why was Francis so terrified of simply measuring the land? Why fight so hard against Hastings' hustabud?
It turns out Francis wasn't just bad at math. His entire economic plan was built on a deeply flawed philosophical assumption about who actually owned India.
Okay, so we are moving from accounting into ideology.
Very much so. Hastings, dealing with reality, explicitly stated he didn't care about the strict legal definition of property in India.
Right.
For Hastings, it didn't really matter if the government, the local tax collector, or the peasant technically owned the soil. His goal was purely functional.
Just make it work.
Ensure the government got its tribute securely, and ensure the ryot, the peasant cultivator, wasn't oppressed. He was looking at function, not labels.
But Francis is a compiler. He loves labels.
Oh, he loves them. He was heavily influenced by fashionable French doctrinaire authors and rigid English feudal law. He approached this incredibly complex Indian land system with a mind poisoned by a very specific feudal maxim.
Which was?
Militaire sans seigneur.
Meaning, no land without a lord.
Exactly. When Francis looked at the native Indian and Mughal systems, his European worldview basically short-circuited.
Because it didn't fit the mold.
Right. The native system was a highly intricate, shared ecosystem of rights.
How does that work?
Well, the government had rights to a share of the produce, the local managers had customary rights to collect it, and the peasants had occupancy rights to farm it. Nobody had absolute exclusive ownership in the way an 18th century Englishman might imagine it.
Francis couldn't handle that ambiguity, could he?
Not at all. Since his mental model required a lord, he just arbitrarily decided that the zamindars must be the absolute owners of the land.
Okay, so who are the zamindars functioning as before Francis decided to give them this massive promotion?
Traditionally, zamindars were essentially local tax farmers and land managers. They took a cut of the revenue for their trouble, and their position was often hereditary, giving them immense local influence.
But they didn't own it.
No, they were part of a web of mutual obligations.
Yeah.
But Francis stripped away all that nuance.
It just wiped it out.
He declared the zamindar the absolute owner of the soil and reduced everyone else, including millions of peasants who had ancestral claims to their farms, to mere tenants at will.
If you're listening to this, imagine a tourist sitting down to play a brand new board game with locals. The locals spend an hour explaining this intricate game with layered rules, mutual resources, and shared obligations.
Okay, yeah.
And the tourist just aggressively slams his hand on the table and says, "No, this board has squares. We are playing Monopoly. You are the banker, I am the landlord. If you land on my space, you owe me rent."
Ah.
He is aggressively enforcing the rules of Monopoly just because it's the only game he understands.
And the irony there is that Francis didn't even understand his own game.
Wait, really?
Yeah, historical legal scholars point out that if Francis actually understood English property law, he would have known that absolute ownership didn't really exist in England either.
Oh, that's fascinating.
English law operated on concepts like dominium utile, the right to use and profit from an estate, while ultimate ownership technically resided with the crown. But Francis just flattened both Indian reality and English law to fit his grand theory.
So Francis essentially turns these local tax collectors into absolute lords overnight. But if you suddenly hand monopoly-level power to a landlord, what happens to the peasants actually farming the board? Because declaring someone a lord doesn't just change the paperwork, it changes human lives.
It absolutely does. And this brings us to the devastating human cost of this ideological battle. Francis was a rigid believer in a laissez-faire approach.
Wow.
He argued the government should completely step back and not intervene to protect the riots, the peasants.
Let me guess his reasoning. The invisible hand of the market will just magically protect the vulnerable peasant farmers.
That was his literal argument. Francis claimed that zamindars would naturally treat the peasants well out of pure economic self-interest.
That is so incredibly naive.
He assumed that if a landlord oppressed his workers, the workers would just pack up and move to a competing zamindar's land. Therefore, the market would regulate itself, and the landlords would be forced to use persuasion and good treatment to keep their estates populated.
If you're listening to this and thinking Francis's plan sounds like a recipe for unmitigated disaster for the working class, you are on the exact same page as Warren Hastings. Did Hastings just let this slide?
No, Hastings fought back aggressively against this purely theoretical a priori argument. Hastings looked at the actual human beings involved.
The reality on the ground.
Right. He pointed out the grim reality. A huge portion of the zamindars were completely incapable of judging what was actually good for their long-term advantage.
Why is that?
Hastings noted that many zamindars were minors, or absentees, or in his rather blunt words, absolute idiots.
Absolute idiots. So they aren't rational economic actors carefully managing their long-term portfolios. They are just coasting.
Exactly. And because they were coasting, they handed the actual management of the estates over to servants, retainers, and middlemen.
Ah, the middlemen.
And these middlemen had no ancestral ties to the land and no long-term interest in its prosperity. Their only goal was to ruthlessly squeeze the peasants for maximum short-term profit to line their own pockets before they got fired or replaced.
The people actually doing the collecting don't care if the farm collapses in 5 years because they only get paid today.
Precisely. And Hastings understood something else that Francis totally missed. He understood the psychology of the farmers themselves.
What do you mean?
Hastings makes this crucial distinction between fixed riots and vagrant riots.
Okay, break that down for me.
This is where Hastings' on-the-ground experience really shines. Fixed riots were the peasants who lived in one spot. They had built substantial houses, they farmed lands inherited from their fathers, they had deep community roots.
So they are tied to the land.
Yes, and Hastings argued that these men would endure immense oppression, extortion, and abuse before they would finally break and abandon their ancestral homes.
So the fixed riots are essentially trapped by their own stability.
Yeah.
The landlord can squeeze them incredibly hard because the emotional and physical cost of leaving is just too high.
Exactly.
So if the fixed riots are trapped, the vagrant riots, the ones wandering without homes, they must be the ones getting completely crushed by this system, right?
You would think so, but the reality on the ground was entirely backward. The vagrant riots actually held the leverage.
Wait, how?
Because they had no ties and no sunk costs. They could walk up to a new zamindar and demand an underrent, a massive discount, just to settle on the land for a season.
Wow. So Francis's unregulated free market actively punishes the most stable, industrious, rooted farmers and heavily rewards the absentee landlords who offer predatory subsidized pricing to transient laborers.
It creates a complete race to the bottom. As Hastings warned, the ancient and industrious tenants are subjected to undue exactions to make up the revenue, while the vagrant riots enjoy lands at half price.
That is entirely dysfunctional.
Ultimately, this dynamic leads straight to the depopulation and ruin of the country.
So we have Hastings, who, despite his flaws and his messy, rushed writing, actually grasps the human psychology and the economic reality of Bengal.
Yes.
And we have Francis operating on pure theory, completely detached from the human beings his policies will destroy.
Exactly.
Given how obviously flawed Francis's ideas were when exposed to reality, how does this story end?
Well, it ends in tragedy, really. Francis managed to win the historical war.
Wait, he won?
He did, not because his ideas were better for India, but because he was a far better PR manager back in England.
How does he package a system that rewards extortion and ignores geography so that London buys it?
By appealing directly to their cultural blind spots. Francis took his curated minutes and his pristine theoretical essays, and he published them back home.
The receipts.
Right. His arguments succeeded brilliantly because he told Englishmen exactly what they already believed in a language they already understood.
Going back to the Monopoly analogy, Francis basically goes back to the Monopoly tournament in London and says, can you believe Hastings is out there trying to play a game without absolute landlords? It's chaos.
That is exactly what happened.
And the English audience looks at Francis's plan to create a neat, tidy hierarchy of landlords and tenants, and they think, well, obviously, that's how civilization works.
He completely weaponized their own common sense assumptions against Hastings' complex truth.
That is devastating.
Francis's PR victory was total. His ideas went on to heavily influence Pitt's India Act of 1784, which locked in many of these disastrous revenue policies.
And what happened to Hastings?
Francis's relentless opposition research culminated in the actual impeachment of Warren Hastings.
So Hastings, the guy desperately trying to adapt policies to keep people alive and the economy functioning, gets impeached. And Francis, the architect of a theoretical disaster, gets his monopoly rules enacted into law.
Yes. Now, the historical records note that Francis's indictment did serve one useful purpose. It secured greater watchfulness and efficiency over the empire, curbing some of the wilder, blatant abuses of power.
Okay, so some silver lining.
But the cost was immense. What stood for trial and condemnation during Hastings' impeachment wasn't just one man. It was the very beginnings of a genuinely paternalistic native administration.
By paternalistic, you mean a government that actually viewed it as their duty to regulate the powerful and protect the vulnerable riots from the zamindars.
Yes, exactly. Hastings was trying to substitute a system of chaotic irresponsibility with a protective native administration.
But he lost.
He lost. Francis's victory replaced that nuanced, protective reality with a system of rigid, imported rules that left the vulnerable completely exposed. It is a classic historical example of how a confident, elegantly packaged narrative can easily defeat a messy, complicated truth.
A confident narrative defeating a complex reality. That is a chilling summary of a lot of history and, frankly, a lot of modern politics.
Unfortunately, yes.
So, to recap our deep dive today, we have Warren Hastings, the pragmatic, adaptable, but politically vulnerable manager trying to govern based on ground truth.
Right.
And we have Philip Francis, the brilliant, cynical compiler who forces an imported, rigid ideology onto a system he refuses to understand and wins because he knows how to manipulate the Home Office.
That is the core dynamic that shaped the subcontinent for generations.
But there is one final detail buried in the historical text that I really cannot stop thinking about. And I want to leave you, the listener, with this thought to chew on.
Okay.
Because it takes this dusty 18th century colonial history and connects it straight to the modern world.
You are thinking of Francis's deep hatred for the provincial councils?
Yes, the records mention that Francis actively dismantled these local provincial councils in India, and his written justification for hating them is absolutely fascinating.
What did he write?
He wrote that the institution was fundamentally wrong because, and I'm quoting the sentiment here, it is contrary to all principle to unite execution with debate.
To unite execution with debate. He wanted them completely severed.
Totally severed. Francis firmly believed that the people debating the rules, setting the budgets, and making the laws should be totally physically separated from the people actually executing them on the ground.
Wow.
He wanted the grand, deliberative council up top in a clean room and mere ministerial clerks down below, just following orders without the power to question them.
A perfectly siloed, top-down structure where feedback from the ground is structurally ignored.
And I want you to think about the structures of the organizations you work in today. Think about that coworker we talked about at the beginning, building their binder of mistakes.
Right.
When the people in the boardroom, the ones debating the rules, setting the 5-year plans, and declaring the revenue targets, are completely intentionally separated from the people on the factory floor or the frontline workers actually executing the job.
Are we just doomed to repeat Philip Francis's mistake?
Exactly. Are we constantly designing elegant, logical systems that look perfect on a spreadsheet, but fail completely and devastatingly when they crash into the real world?
It is the eternal question every large organization has to answer, because reality, unlike a theoretical budget, never stays fixed.
Keep an eye out for the Philip Francises in your office. And maybe, just maybe, cut the Warren Hastingses a little slack when they have to change their minds to keep the ship afloat. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.